Hello, I'm Diana Mendez, Corporate President of Infrastructure and Mobility Equity for HNTB. HNTB is proud to partner with APTA as the sponsor for today's special Kaleidoscope event celebrating Black History Month. We at HNTB are committed to supporting federal, state, and local partners and the transportation industry in adopting policies and practices that create more inclusive infrastructure for all. Working together, our industry can deliver more equitable access to opportunity through transit improvements that are so critical to supporting thriving communities, while we create new jobs, build a diverse workforce, expand small businesses, and advance generational wealth throughout the country. With that in mind, APTA has brought together 3 important industry leaders for an open, candid conversation, offering their unique perspectives about race, equity, and the wealth gap in our nation. And now, here is our program.
Welcome to Kaleidoscope, a product of APTA U. This monthly webinar series focuses on elevating diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the public transit industry. Through Kaleidoscope, a key component of APTA's Racial Equity Action Plan, we will provide guidance to support your efforts on this important topic. It is here that we will engage experts from within and outside our industry on a wide range of topics, with the intent of raising awareness of systemic racial and social inequities, creating successful diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and implementing equity assessments. We invite you to enjoy this edition of Kaleidoscope. Hi, I'm Steve Mayberry with the Chicago Transit Authority, and I'm delighted and honored to serve as the host and moderator for our discussion today. I'm excited to welcome you to this very special 2-part edition of Kaleidoscope, an APTA U series. The Kaleidoscope series is organized in the context of the APTA Racial Equity Action Plan, which underscores APTA's fundamental position that addressing racism requires all of us to be an active part of the solution. This series aims to provide a platform for the sharing of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, programs, and policies within the transit industry. Today's edition of Kaleidoscope is unique in honor of Black History Month. Instead of a webinar, we have brought together 3 esteemed leaders to have a frank conversation about being Black in the transit industry, the progress that has been made, and their hopes for the future of racial equity in transit. Dorval Carter Jr. is the APTA Chair and serves as president of the Chicago Transit Authority, the nation's 2nd largest transit agency, where he oversees more than 10,000 employees. Prior to becoming CTA president in 2015, Mr. Carter served as the U.S. Department of Transportation Acting Chief of Staff to Secretary Anthony Foxx. He also served as Acting Deputy Administrator for the FTA and served as the FTA's Chief Counsel. Phillip Washington serves as the CEO of the Denver International Airport. Prior to that, he served 6 years as CEO of the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. From 2000 to 2015, Washington served as Assistant General Manager and then General Manager and CEO for Denver's Regional Transportation District. He also served as head of the Biden-Harris Transportation Transition Committee and is the co-founder of the Equity and Infrastructure Project. Last but not least, he is also a former APTA Chair. Adelee LeGrand is the APTA Vice Chair and also serves as the Vice Chair of the APTA Diversity and Inclusion Council. She serves as the CEO of the Hillsborough Transit Authority in Tampa, Florida. Each of these individuals brings a different perspective, and I'm very excited about the conversation we are about to have. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
I want to start with the fact that you have all risen to public transit leadership at a time when there isn't that much representation at the executive level for Black people. Now, your journeys are all unique. And Adelee, if you don't mind, I'd like for you to talk about some of the things you've had to overcome, some of the challenges you faced, and what you did to overcome them.
So thank you, Steve, and I'm happy to be here with both Dorval and Phil, two, I would say, colleagues that I've been fortunate to work with over the last couple of decades. So I'm definitely dating myself. But through that process, right, the last 20 or so years, I spent most of my time in the private sector. So it was a different space. It was still challenging to be one of only a few Black women moving, matriculating on the private side, still working for transit agencies. So you did see yourself in rooms, but not within the organization that you actually work for, in my case. I would say that part of the journey, though, was really focused on what you could deliver, right? The value of the work, understanding your body of work, being able to sell projects to clients like Dorval or Phil during those days. And you could keep your head down, and as long as you had solid deliverables and products that were valuable, you'd be okay. I would say this next phase of my journey of being in the public sector side and serving as an executive, it's more political. And if you're not aware of the politics or you haven't spent a career navigating the political space, it's a little more challenging. So what I would say for me, what I have to learn and continue to learn is, how do you transition from being a technician to being a politician, right? In a space where you still have to have the technical acumen so you can lead a team and discern if people are doing the right thing, but then also really understanding that as the CEO, it's more of a political job, and you really have to understand how to navigate and play in that space.
So, Dorval, I want to stay with the original question. But Adelee raised that politics piece. And because you've worked at the federal level, because you work in Chicago in an appointed position, please include that also as part of your response.
No, it's interesting because I also sort of came up through an unusual path and to my leadership position. I wasn't on the operational side of our agency. I was on the administrative side. I started off as a staff attorney and worked in the legal realm, which is not the usual way you work your way up to the top levels of any organization. In fact, you were asking us about experiences that we had along the way. I can remember a time very early in my career where a top executive at CTA pulled me aside and basically told me that I had gone about as far as I was going to go in this organization, and you should really think about whether you're happy where you're at or whether you need to move on.
Wow.
That person who's still around, although not at CTA, I'm sure would have a few things to say now about the fact that I'm leading the organization. But the point that I wanted to make was that a big part of my journey was about perseverance. It was like, people don't necessarily believe in you or have faith in you at face value. I always felt like I had to work longer. I had to work harder. I had to be prepared to be the smartest person in the room at certain points in my career because that's how you got recognized. And it's very different than on the private sector because, in the public sector, you're not necessarily being driven by the product deliverables that you're doing. You're right. It's very political. And so a lot of it is how are you getting recognized and where are you getting recognized and what are you getting recognized for? And in our world, that could be either for something good or for something very bad. And depending upon how that plays out, that can either make your career or break it. There were times early in my career when I would go to conferences and I was the only Black person in the room. I look at our conferences today and I see the level of diversity that didn't exist when I started 38 years ago. And I'm happy about that. But clearly, I had to make my own path, my own way. And obviously, I had a lot of help along the way to make that happen.
It's interesting you make that point because we're going to get back to that very topic a little bit later on. Phil, I wonder if I can get you to share on those same lines.
Well, let me pick up where Dorval was talking about, this idea of perseverance. Very, very necessary, in leadership roles that we have. I also think about transit now is much more than just getting the buses and trains out. The political acumen, dealing with labor unions, dealing with stakeholders. If you have to lead the effort to pass a referendum, this is convening people. This is going out into any community, and not just the African-American community, but any community, and being able to convince people about the value of public transportation. And it's not always easy. And so doing all these things, sort of other duties as assigned almost, becomes very, very challenging for anybody, but especially for people of color that are in leadership positions.
Sure.
I recall an incident where, and it wasn't really an incident, it was just more of a, it was probably about 4 or 5 of us, and we were talking to a group of people from the community. And I was the only African American of that 4 or 5. And one of the guys that was with me thought he would ask a question of the people from the community. And it was, he said, and he was a white guy. He was a good friend of mine. He said, he asked the folks we were there with, he said, who do you think is the CEO of the agency? And I was shocked that he was, asking folks that question.
Yeah.
And they invariably said he was.
Oh, wow.
And I was standing there as the CEO. So, it wasn't a slight to me, really, but it's you get to thinking about the, what other people are thinking, and you begin to think about what expectations that people have of the agency when you have an African American leader at the helm. So it's those kinds of things I think that we have to think about as we go forward.
Phil, just picking up on that a little bit, there is a level of underestimating us.
Yes.
That we all deal with in our positions. People don't appreciate or don't realize what it really takes to run these kind of organizations. And Phil talked about some of the skills. Let me just tell you, that's just a portion of the skills that you need to run a transit system. And most of us have developed these skills over the course of our career in various roles and responsibilities that we've had. But it really starts with the fact that, people underestimate how good we are at what we do until they see you in action. And then they're kind of like, oh, well, he knows his stuff. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise that I know my stuff. At this point in my life and given the stuff that I've done. But, one of the things that I carry in my job is you always keep a chip on your shoulder. You always feel like, okay, once again, I got to go prove that I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm talking about. And it's not, in many cases, like Phil said, it's not overt racism, but it's just this belief that you got here for some other reason other than your skill and your capability to do it.
Sure. Sure.
I'm a transit professional. I may be one of the first transit professionals that's actually sat in the seat that I'm in right now, but I get challenged more than the people before me who weren't transit professionals.
Sure.
So why is that?
And I would say to that, though, there's the flip side, right? Because then sometimes they want us to be magical. Right? So they want us to, now you've proven yourself, and now they want you to make something happen that no one can make happen. And then when you can't deliver on it, it's like, well, what's wrong with you? Why? I thought you were so great. You have all the acumen, and you can't turn a bus into a flying machine, So that's the balance. And you try to find ways to, as you say, persevere and stay, current with what's going on and the trends and being knowledgeable. But then you get to this place where you have a little bit of comfort sets in. And I don't know if it's like this for you, Dorval and Phil, but then you're always telling yourself, don't get comfortable, right? Because not that you don't believe that this space is real, but there is this lingering feeling, right, and thought in the back of your head that at any moment they can pull the rug from underneath you, right? So it could be, you can't do this magical thing. So now, the value isn't there any longer. And I would say, it's not just being a CEO, but it's a part of the whole journey. When you're in a space where you're the only person or one of many, limited numbers of people who look like you or sound like you or even have a similar background as you always are thinking okay, when am I going to get the call, right? When is it, that they're going to say, all right, you've been in the seat long enough, and now it's time for the next flavor that we want.
Can I tag on that too?
Please.
Because I think about a couple of things. One, this idea of perseverance. my mom used to always tell me, Phil, encourage yourself.
Right.
Because I think, if I'm old enough to remember, my grandfather, my grandmother, who had this thought about maybe we're not good enough.
Oh.
They grew up that way.
Sure.
They grew up in this mindset of, listen, just get you a job over here.
Right.
Don't worry about any leadership thing. You got a job, you pay the mortgage or whatever.
Keep your head down.
Yeah, keep your head down,
Sure,
keep your head
sure.
down kind of thing. And I think that for a generation, probably several generations, that was the mindset. And, this whole thing about, just again, keep your head down, keep cool. And you began to be conditioned that way. Now, young people, and I think this is great, young people don't think that way anymore.
Right.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful thing. But from generations past, including my mother's generation, we grew up that way to think, just keep your head down, and you begin to get conditioned that way.
Sure.
So I appreciate the way young people think now. They think like, hey, listen, this is mine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm going after it, and I just love that mindset.
So I want to go kind of macro and micro. And what I mean by that is most of us first learned about transit equity in grade school, Rosa Parks. It's a single instance of racism that's highlighted to really talk about systemic racism. It doesn't happen in Montgomery, Alabama, if it's not almost accepted nationwide that there's this second-class notion of citizenship for African Americans. The question I want to ask you, Rosa Parks, for instance, has always stayed with me. What instances, be they single or systemic, have stayed with you in your leadership roles? Kind of what's always in the back of your mind as you consider systemic racism, especially as it involves public transportation? And here I really am talking about things of the past. We're going to bring it more to the present, but I really want to see if there's anything that has just stayed with you and that stays with you as you execute your duties.
Well, I have, over the course of my career, probably dealt with at least, I lose count now, how many financial crises I dealt with at the Chicago Transit Authority. And when you talk about systemic racism around transportation, you have to have a conversation about funding.
Sure.
And in a city like Chicago, there are 3 transit systems that operate in the city. 2 of them are suburban focused, 1 is city focused. The city focused agency has always had financial challenges. The money has never really been there to support the system the way it's supposed to be. That's a systemic issue.
Sure.
That is a deliberate decision that was made about how funding would work in our region that put one agency in a much more financially difficult position than the others. And it was touted as a good management tool. But when you look at the impact of what that meant that the people who relied on public transit the most, who are low income, minority, and oh, by the way, don't carry the same political clout as other parts of our city, are the ones who end up with the worst service. And you constantly recognize that challenge in roles that we're in. And I can't speak for Adelee or Phil and their experience with the agencies they worked at, but when you start having the conversation about you need more money for transit, inevitably it becomes a racial conversation.
Yeah, sure.
And that gets back to the broader discussion that we have in our society about what kind of community we want to live in and what kind of opportunities do we want to create for the people who live in our communities.
Sure. Mr. Washington?
Yeah, let me just pick up on what Dorval is saying. Dorval and I have had great conversations about this, and I, let me personalize this issue.
Sure.
I'm from the South Side of Chicago, and we lived in a community, public housing, that had, the frequency of buses and all that was, I think, every 30 minutes.
Oh, wow.
It was run by a contracted service, I forget the South Suburban, whatever it was. And it caused one of my older sisters incredible challenges as she was trying to be the first college graduate in our family. She rode the bus about 2.5 hours one way on the other side of Chicago to get to school. So even before I got into transportation, I had some knowledge of frequencies of buses and, that kind of thing, and run times and all of that. And when we start talking about disadvantages, I mean, when I was in Los Angeles, 70% of our ridership was below the poverty level.
Oh, wow.
70%.
Yeah.
And I think probably the only other city that's close is Chicago in terms of the number of ridership that's below the poverty line. That's pretty incredible.
It is.
But I watch my sister every morning leave the house to get to, say, an 8 o'clock class. She was leaving the house at 5:30 in the morning. This is why it's so important to me now that Dorval is building a rail line to that community that I grew up in.
The Red Line Extension.
The Red Line Extension to 130th. It's incredible when you think about the challenges that communities have. And I just give one example. I mean, I could give other examples of my mother waiting on the, in the cold at a bus stop and that sort of thing.
Sure.
But we need to think about these are lives that we're talking about that are impacted by transportation. One last thought, I can't think of anything that impacts people's lives more than transportation, maybe healthcare. But I mean, and I'm talking about transportation infrastructure included in that too, sidewalks, streets, all of this. And so the work that we're doing is very, very important, not just to everyone that lives in our region, but especially those folks that are poor, and below the poverty line itself.
Sure. I'm going to stay with the rail line extension for one moment. Dorval, you talk all the time about how that is the most important project you're going to work on during your time. And we discuss with some frequency how the project itself is an expression of equity that happens across $3.6 billion. So it's not a small one. Talk a little bit more about what that means to you, both in terms of your personal connection to it, but then also what it means for Chicago, for the South Side, specifically the far South Side.
Sure. I would echo everything that Phil just said about that community, Oakdale Gardens, which, if you understood the geography of Oakdale Gardens, for the life of me, you will never be able to explain to me why a public housing project was built in this part of the city of Chicago. It is completely isolated from any of the transportation or any other services for that matter in the city. It is if you wanted to build an island in the middle of the Pacific and put all the poor people on it, that's what you do at Oakdale Gardens. Like creating an island and putting a bunch of poor people on it and saying, you all stay out there, you all figure it out. We're all going to continue to live our lives somewhere else. And Phil will know this because I know it. Ever since we were kids, we heard about this extension of the train line to that part of the city. Now, city of Chicago is probably blessed with one of the most robust transit systems in the country. Literally, just about every corner of the city has rail service except one. And that one corner is on the far south side of the city. It is minority, it is low income, it is economically depressed, and there has never been the will to pursue the funding necessary to make it happen. And that's why, when I keep talking about funding, that's the point I'm making, is that we work we work in an environment where you never have enough money to do everything that you want to do. So it becomes a prioritization conversation. Where are you prioritizing the resources that you have, and how do you want to prioritize them? Hopefully to meet the needs of the community that you serve.
Sure.
And, from my perspective, from the first day that I became president and finally had control of the priorities of our organization, I knew what my priority was going to be. It was going to be to build this line to this part of the city. And I recognized that my legacy, my value for what I brought to this organization was a focus on addressing the kind of issues like this that are equity-based and that were institutionally and structurally in place to really mostly impact minority communities and communities of color.
Gotcha. Adelee, I don't want to leave this before checking in with you. As a transit leader, when you look at systemic racism, what stays with you and kind of informs your views as a CEO and how you approach your job?
So, listening to both Dorval and Phil, don't want to be redundant, but it's the same theme everywhere, I would say. And, you look at how communities are built. I'm a planner, right? So it was deliberate on how communities were built. Just like your community, Phil, someone decided to put you far away from everything. But what I see today as a leader of an agency, again, where the majority of our riders are, low income, minority community members, it's access to work and jobs and, schools and medical institutions. What has happened because of the way we design cities, we have limited the opportunities for people to get out of those conditions. But that is deliberate as well, right? So we created this problem. We put you in this environment. We provide you with services that are underfunded. So we can't give you the frequency. It takes you 2 hours to get someplace that'll allow you to have a better education. And then we still pile on even more challenges for someone to just being able to access our system and get to places that are important for them and their family. So it's one of those things where, yes, things happened in the past, but even today, it's the same struggle. It's not like the struggle has changed over the last 10, 20, 40 years. You still have a community of people who are trying to navigate getting their kids to school, go to a job, pick up something for dinner from a grocery store. In most of these communities, they don't even have grocery stores in their community, right? So they're trying to figure out how to navigate with 2 kids in a stroller after they pick them up from daycare and go to the grocery store and then get them on the bus with packages. It's a lot that we're putting on our community. And then we are surprised about all the challenges that we face as, public transit agencies with some of the interactions between our customers and our operators, right? We have created, and I say we as a society have created this mental, I would say, strain on certain groups of people, primarily Black and brown, to make it extremely difficult for them to navigate the basic things that everybody has to navigate in life. And then we don't have the resources to provide mental health training. We don't have the resources to help combat homelessness, but these are our customers. And these are the struggles and the challenges that we have to, address. And it all came to pass because of the systemic racism.
It's
right?
funny, as you're speaking, and I know that all of you had to deal with this as transit leaders, everything you're talking about was given a megaphone, like it got bigger against the backdrop of the pandemic. That's what I can't stop thinking about. You know, if you were already having a hard time getting to healthcare, if you were already having a hard time in terms of accessing food or being in a food desert, everything got worse. And we found out then just how important public transit really was in terms of helping people live their lives.
But you know what?
Yes, sir.
The difference is, when that was recognized during the pandemic, they gave us money.
Yes, it's a great
They
point.
gave us more money than we'd ever seen ever to keep it going. Now, we're all sitting here trying to figure out what happens when that money runs out.
Exactly.
Because it's like, the pandemic is over, the need to look at this is over, and the truth of the matter is those problems didn't go away. And if anything, as Adelee is saying, it's gotten worse. But you know who sees it the most? We do.
We do.
Yes.
Because, and I firmly believe this, public transit systems are a reflection of the communities that we serve. When there are mental health issues going on in the community, we see it on our system. When there's homelessness going on in our community, we see it on our system. The point being is that it is a mirror of what's really going on, because a public transit system is like the biggest social experiment that you could ever have, because there is no other activity that anyone engages in that has a common set of experiences that brings together so many diverse people every single day. And if you stop and think about it, you know, I don't know what your daily ridership is, Adelee and Phil. When you were in LA, I know your ridership was really close to mine.
Yeah.
There is no other job that I know of in the public sector that personally influences hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every day.
That's right.
And as a result, we begin to understand what's going on in our society that isn't being addressed.
Sure.
And the worst part about it, as Adelee said, is that we're then looked at as if we're supposed to fix the problem.
Sure.
Right.
And like I said, I can't fix homelessness. I can't fix the mental health problem that's going on. I can't solve crime that's happening, you know, throughout the city or in society in general. But because it ends up on our system, we are looked at as part of the problem.
Part of the problem.
Sure.
And not part of the solution.
Exactly.
And that's the problem, because we should be part of the solution. We're supposed to be providing access, mobility, the opportunity, the things that ultimately will get you out of these kind of problems, get you to a healthcare clinic, get you to a mental health facility, get you all these other things that you need to do. And if handled properly, that would be a positive outcome for our communities. But yet we face the other challenges that haven't been addressed and then play themselves out on our systems.
Yeah, let me just add to that, because you're exactly right, and I agree. I mean, this is scope creep for public transportation leaders.
Yeah.
This is what this is.
Yes, exactly.
And it's really incredible. Transit is a barometer of the societal issues that we have. And the issues and the challenges, we talk about political acumen needed in public transportation leaders. But the other piece is being able to go out to communities and talk to them about these issues. And so there is a community and stakeholder convening characteristic, I think, that we now need to have. It's more than just putting the buses and trains out.
Sure.
And if you add on to this, at least in my case, if you are pursuing a referendum to improve the services or build new capital projects, that's another element to this. And so the ability to be able to go out for public transit leaders, which I know, is down in Florida as well, and to convince people to invest in transit or transportation is another skill set that we absolutely need. And so the requirements, the things that we need to do as public transportation leaders is expanding exponentially, because transit is so close, to the community. I mean, I think it's closer than any other mode, because you got young people, you got people in the community, in my case with an airport now, that will never probably go to the airport. They may never, unless they have a job there, they may never get on a plane ever in their lives. I knew folks from that public housing community that I was growing up that had never been downtown Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And so transit becomes so close to the community because you got to do these community meetings and all these kinds of things. It's different from any other mode. And it's really, as Dorval said, a reflection of the societal issues that are going on in communities all over this country.
It's interesting. APTA's theme this year is telling our stories. And it sounds like that's what needs to happen. I mean, the stories get told about the importance of public transportation, about why it needs to be adequately funded, why we need to make sure that we take a look at the legacy of these bad decisions in the past and help undo some of that.
But I think we also, Steve, have to do a better job. And when I say we, I'm putting us all into this, of elevating the value of transit. Because I'm from New York, the south side of Queens, not Chicago. But, you know, I grew up riding transit, right? Took transit all over New York City. But as a young person, you know, once you get out of high school and you go to college or whatever you choose to do, once you start making your own money, you want a car, right? You're not, even from New York, where we have transit everywhere, it wasn't like I never want a car, right? There are people now, there's a cohort of people that they're saying don't want to have cars, but as soon as they have kids, we're seeing that that is changing, that they do want to have cars and they want to move further out so that they, you know, can have that experience. We still have this stigma associated with having to ride transit, right? So there's a nuance. There's people who have chosen to say, I want to do without a car because they live in a community where they can walk to a grocery store. They probably can walk to a Target. They have open spaces, lots of great shops and coffee shops and restaurants. So they're making this choice because they have an environment that was built to allow them to not rely on a car. But the folks who have to ride transit are still living in these communities that don't have any of those things, right? And in their mind, riding transit is not at the same level as being able to afford your own car. And we have to do a better job of making it clear that riding transit and owning a car, it's not one, it's less than the other. And the value of choosing and being able to ride transit, how great it is for the environment, how great it is for the economy, you know, how we can leverage some of our other infrastructure investments if we have people using public transit. We don't do a good job about advocating and selling and promoting the value of public transit. So our customers have the burden of life, and then they feel like they're in a second or third tier because they have to ride transit. So I think there's work for us to do to really elevate the value that transit brings to everyone, those who ride it and those who don't ride it, right? It's great for the environment, it's great for society. We need to celebrate that.
Can I piggyback on that? Because I think you're bringing up an incredible point. I mean, I think what we saw in terms of societal issues, probably, I mean, when I was growing up, if someone saw you on public transit, it'd be like, hey man, you pretty down on your luck, man. You know, hey, do you need a loan or whatever? We saw you on the bus. Did you lose your job or whatever? And so there was this stigma even when I was growing up, even though we had to catch the bus all the time, and everybody in our community was catching the bus, you know, anyway. Very few folks had cars. So I think, you know, this getting rid of that stigma is one thing. The other thing is land use around transit. You know, this idea, I kind of coined this phrase of transit-oriented communities. And so this is another skill set that is required now in transportation leaders, right? Public transportation leaders, right? I mean, transit authorities, public transportation entities find themselves with a lot of land now around stations. And so what tends to happen is very little or very few of these developments are affordable, which could lead to transit use as well. And so I bring that up about transit-oriented communities because now, instead of having that stigma of riding public transportation, now folks want apartments, they want to live right there, and they're not affordable. And so the same transit investment that entities are doing that was, you thought, in the environmental phase of the project for the people that's living there, by the time it's built, it's a different set of people living there.
Right, it's the people who choose not to have a car.
Exactly. Exactly.
There, right. And they can afford to have all those great amenities that the transit-oriented community brought.
Well, and to that point, that, you know, that's part of the complexity of our jobs right now, is that, you know, we were talking about the red line extension and the impact it's going to have in that community. Clearly, one of the concerns is exactly that, gentrification
Yes.
of that entire part of the city, because you got a spanking brand new multi-billion-dollar investment that is now sitting there. And that means that the public policy conversation around land use planning and equitable, development and everything like that has to get integrated into my transportation planning in order to, and coordinated in a way that you can basically mitigate against that type of an impact. All of which, of course, is getting to the broader equity issue that we're talking about. And so, when it used to be the conversation about equity as a transit professional meant nothing more than me providing service someplace.
Yes.
Now, it's a whole complicated interaction with all sorts of programs and policies.
That's right.
It involves other governmental agencies, all of which you have to work with, and and the community, in a very direct way to try to deliver a project that not only is complicated in and of itself because of the nuts and bolts of what it takes to build something, but it's also complicated from a policy standpoint in terms of all the things that need to come together to truly make sure that it is equitable in what it does and the impact that it has on the community that you're trying to provide the benefits to. And that's a much more complicated interaction.
Absolutely.
But it's part of the skill mix that we have to have in these positions to basically, one, recognize that. And that's a big part of the equity conversation begins with recognizing where the bias and the inequitable activity is occurring. And then strategically figuring out how you're going to address it. And if you're able to figure out the first, then you can at least start, working towards how you address the second part of that. But, when you're creating your organization and you're deciding on who you're going to put into leadership positions within your organization, things like that, you have to keep that in mind. Because you need people who are representative of the communities that you serve, who also bring that perspective to the conversations you're having. Because when you're impacting as many people as we impact every day, the law of unintended consequences, the thing you do that you think is good, that ends up having just the opposite effect because you didn't recognize what it was really going to do to the community, that becomes a very real concern. And I don't have the money to just throw stuff away and find out after the fact, oh, well, it didn't work out the way I wanted it to, so I need to, do-overs are something that don't happen in our industry.
Sure.
You get one shot, and as Adelee was saying, in these jobs, don't get too comfortable because, because you're a hero one day and you're a goat the next. And so, a lot of it goes to when you're making these decisions, you're making the right decision at the right time for the people that you're trying to make that decision for. And that requires a lot of skill.
That's right. I mean, this test case, we have to see what happens to Argyle Gardens.
A
brand new rail line. I mean, this whole land use discussion is incredibly integral to the work that we do. I used to always say, we don't control everything, in terms of our stations and all that, but we are such an influencer. We can be an instigator in a good way on behalf of communities. That has become part of our job now, whether we like it or not. It's become part of our job. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens to an Argyle Gardens with a multi-billion-dollar rail line, and that being the terminus, of that rail line, the current terminus, right?
Yes.
Because when you talk about some of those cities that are right on the edge, your home city, Gary, Indiana, and all of that. What happens? Because those people will come up to that terminus, right? To park and go downtown. So the evolution of all of this and the rail line and the land use policies and all those things that we've been talking about become very, very relevant.
President Carter, a minute ago, you were saying that in order to be effective on equity, you have to kind of root out the core issues in the inequity itself. Plessy versus Ferguson, you're attorney by training. Since that landmark Supreme Court case, let's be generous and say things have gotten better, right? It's no longer really a question of whether or not any of you can just step on the public transit. But you also reference the inequity doesn't always look the same. It's not always just that you can't get on the bus. It's not always that we're just killing off, say, bus routes on the blacker, poorer side of town. We see new things pop up. Sometimes it's embedded in old policies, or sometimes it's just something new, something we didn't see coming. I'd like to ask you folks to talk a little bit about those types of instances where something popped up that wasn't as overt, but was still powerful and still impacted people. Would you like to start that?
Yeah, it's I keep going back to money.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times rooted in the cloak of financial discipline can be very racist policies. And when I was working at the Federal Transit Administration, under the Capital Investment Grant Program, we had a lot of policies that we put in place that were intended to really make sure that the best projects fiscally were the ones that got funded. And on its face, that looked like a good government policy. It looked like the type of thing that you want to promote. You want to be sure you're spending money efficiently, so on and so forth. But what we didn't realize at the time is that the metrics that would decide whether or not a project was a good financial investment many times worked against communities of color. And the thing to keep in mind about public transportation is that the people who need it the most are rarely able to support financially the services that they need.
Right.
And so, CTA runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The people who are routing my OWL service, I've not seen a level of ridership that supports the revenues or generates the revenues necessary to support the level of service I need to provide. That is because we're providing it for a different reason.
Yeah.
We're providing it because these individuals have no other choice, and their ability to get to their job, to get to health care, to get to school, whatever it is totally dependent on their ability to get on that bus. So when you hear people complain or talk about how inefficient public transit is because you're carrying 8 people on a bus at 2 a.m. in the morning,
Right.
There's a lost understanding of why are those 8 people on the bus at 2 a.m. in the morning.
Right.
Sure.
And part of what my job is as a CEO is to constantly keep questioning the policies and practices that we're using from an equity perspective. It is a combination of, one, listening to your community and hearing, because Phil, this, people in Alco Gardens will tell you in a second what's equitable, what isn't equitable, what they're getting. They don't have any problem speaking up and telling you that this is stupid.
Sure.
Whether you want to hear it or not.
That's serving to provide and meet my needs, so on and so forth. You gotta have systems in place that allow you to hear that. And then you gotta be able to be receptive to what it's going to take to address it. And the example that I gave you, when we realized that our policy was basically, in this case, it was preventing the building of a station that would primarily serve a minority community because of the fact that station didn't meet the cost criteria that are associated with that program.
Sure.
And if they took that station out, then the project could meet the cost criteria. Right. So who ends up losing there?
Yeah.
The community that basically needed the service the most.
Wow.
And so, we changed the policy. We did exactly what I just said. We heard from the community. We recognized that something was going on here that was not the intention of why that policy existed, and that we could modify that policy in a way that would allow us to address that wrong and to fix that. And that, to me, is a big part of what, being an equitable leader is all about. And it requires a constant reevaluation of what you're doing and whether or not you're accomplishing the goal that you set out to do at the very beginning. And to your point, Adelee, about getting comfortable. That's why you can't get comfortable.
Right.
Sure.
That's right.
Because you may think you're doing a great job. You may think you've got everything working the way it's supposed to be and you're providing the service that people want and all that, and then you find out you're not.
Yeah.
There's something you touched upon. I'm going to throw it to you, Phil. So you were in LA, a very diverse area, right? A lot of Latino individuals, of course. You have a lot of many constituencies that you have to worry about. But then also, you need to think in terms of how do I best provide for everyone? So you're thinking about where the service is running, the type of service. Again, since this is the biggest part of it, you're still building up the system in the way that Chicago has this large system in place, this big legacy system, bunch of rail stations, et cetera. You were still in the process of building rail stations. I saw one of them when you were there. So I'm curious in terms of how you approach that from an equitable point of view. And ensuring that no one's kind of left behind in terms of services and the provision of public transit. What was your approach?
Well, before I go there, I just want to pick up something Dorval said, because everything you said, I think about how it leads to diversity of perspective. The need for diversity of perspective. And that is why you need diversity at the table. Because you wouldn't know that if there was no diversity at the table or diversity perspective at the table. And I think, about the same thing with, we put together a group in Los Angeles called the Women and Girls Governing Council, because we wanted to understand and have the perspective on how women travel on the system, because that's a whole nother thing, right? I mean, women, they have to maybe drop off kids at the babysitter, things like, how do women travel? They're more concerned about safety probably, And so this idea of diversity of perspective is very, very key. To your question, what goes into sort of building a system and lines, we designed an evaluative criteria that included equity to determine where these lines should go and the sequence of building them out, because that's another thing, right? And what we found was, in many cases, and how we determined the sequence of build was largely around equity. And now this was before the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That is a good thing. And before, the notice of funding opportunities that are coming up around equity right now. But that criteria that we put together that had equity, accessibility, as well as criteria for where we build and when we build was a huge piece of how we developed all of that. And so what you will see now, and by the way, we were bold enough to say, hey, listen, this referendum should be forever. It should have no sunset. Because if you build it, you got to take care of it.
Right.
That's the other piece, because if you don't do the asset management piece of this, you end up with another decision of when do you repair the lines, and making sure that a line in underserved communities don't become last on the list for maintenance as well.
So every step of this process is kind of pregnant with an equity consideration.
I think so. The life cycle of these infrastructure investments, I think, is very key, because the O&M of a project will last much longer than the design build. And so these things become very, very important for the agency and those who are leading the agency.
Steve, I would say to your last question that you posed, what is different from, since Plessy versus Ferguson, and what are the things that we didn't expect to have to grapple with? So two things that come to mind for me. One, being in the public transit space, the onus is on us to define and, defend the fare box recovery, how much is subsidized for transit. But our brothers and sisters on the highway side, which is heavily subsidized, more subsidized than transit, do not have that same expectation to explain how much does it really cost to operate and maintain the highway system, and how much are people really contributing to that in their own personal vehicles, right?
Sure.
You never hear that conversation.
That's a great point.
But it's a real thing, right? The motor fuel tax does not cover the cost to keep the road system up and running. But you don't hear any politician standing up and saying, you know, we need to have a special user's tax to just drive your car so that you're covering the cost of driving on our roads, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that we don't really talk about, but it shows that there is inequity, modal inequity, because the onus again is on us to define and describe and, you know, I would say explain away constantly why it is that our passengers do not cover the total cost of riding transit. So that would be one. The other I would say is that back to land use, what I've seen being in Tampa for 2 years is that there's some communities, you know, Tampa's hot now, and lots of people are moving to Tampa. So the housing costs have gone up, similar to Chicago, Denver, you know, all over the United States. And because of this, you know, people who were living in communities, even if they had some limitations in those communities, they did have like that social support network in those communities, right? You may have been there for generations. You had a local church, or, you know, you just had a network of people who you could rely on to help you babysit if you had to run an errand or something like that. But now you can't afford to live in these communities.
Sure.
So you're moving further out where it's cheaper. But guess what we don't have a lot of when you move further out? Transit.
Sure.
Right? So now what we're doing is, again, it's something that we didn't see, right? Coming out of, now everybody can get on the bus, but our communities have changed because people can't afford to live where the bus is. So now we're pushing people further out. We're designing great communities further out with no access to transit or very limited access to transit. So then, you know, we have more miles we have to drive to get people far, far away and bring them back, the deadhead miles that we have to pay for. So, and the funding, as Dorval said, but then also it's like the convergence of the land use, the policy decisions, and then making, it goes back to, I think, a comment I made earlier, that we have marginalized public transit so much so that the industry is required to explain how we're subsidized, but no other mode has to do that. And all of the modes are subsidized, all of them, right? But we are the ones who have to constantly remind people or explain to people why it's okay that we're subsidized. And I think, you know, not until we can get to a place where we address that, can we say there's equity, modal equity, right? So once we get modal equity, then we can start talking about all the cherries on top, right?
What a great point.
Well, I think you're right, and you have to take that head on.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to call that out, because people get uncomfortable when you start talking about racial bias. But what you're talking about is exactly that. The concept of recovery ratio, once again, is another one of those things that was viewed as, quote, a fiscally responsible activity that was only placed on public transportation. And as Adelee pointed out, not on any other mode of transportation. And I go back to, I think even farther than you take it, Adelee. I'm kind of like, when you talk about your police services, do you look for recovery ratio? Do you talk about your fire services?
Great
Do you
point.
look for recovery ratio? I said, you want those services because it's a public good.
Exactly.
And at the end of the day, it benefits the public as a whole. Public transportation is the exact same thing. But yet we face this sort of fiscal, you know, justification process that no one else faces. And I think that's even more insidious than even the highway example, because you know, you can argue whether you need more roads. A lot of people say you don't need more roads, but look what happens to the community when it loses public transportation. We got examples of that all over this country. And the reality is that the impact that has, particularly on economically depressed communities, is horrific. It is the type of scenario that ultimately destroys not just the community, but the urban city that community lives in. You want a strong city, town, whatever, that you need for it to be economically strong. You want it to be economically strong, you need to give people mobility. If you don't give them mobility, you're not able to achieve anything. So we are foundational and this is the point I think you were making, Adelee, about we don't make this case well enough.
We don't.
Yeah.
But we are foundational to the economic development and support of the communities that we operate in. And we need for our elected officials, particularly the ones that fund us, to appreciate that. Mm-hmm. We created our own challenge around measurement of success when we view ridership as the, quote, measurement of success in our industry. And if you talk to anybody, you're kind of like, well, what's your ridership? Your ridership is at a certain level, then why should I be giving you money? You should be giving me money because of other things that we provide besides the pure ridership number.
Sure.
And if we can't broaden that definition in a way of how you measure a successful public transportation service, then we are doomed as an industry. I'll just put it that way. Because particularly in a post-pandemic environment, the ridership numbers aren't there. They're coming back, but they're not coming back as strongly as we want them to. And we got a limited amount of time before we're not going to be able to financially support what we're doing. So you got to make, if there's ever a time to make the broader argument, that time is now.
Absolutely.
This is a fantastic discussion, and we invite you to join us for part 2.